welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. I'm going to tell you a story. So if you are a person of a certain age, meaning if you were in high school and college, 1983, you probably listened to the radio or watched MTV. And if you did, there's a song that would have been very popular that you would no doubt remember. A song by the group called Fix. The title, One Thing Leads to Another. Trust me, that's going to be the theme of our conversation this week. More on that in a second. The lyrics. You told me something wrong. I know I listened too long, but one thing leads to another. Then it's easy to believe somebody's been lying to me. But when the wrong word goes in the right ear, I know you've been lying to me. It's getting rough off the cuff. I've got to say, enough's enough. It's a very catchy tune, super popular in the United Kingdom, super popular here in the United States. Why do I bring that up? One thing leads to another. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the theme of the book we're going to be talking about this week. The book is called Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. The author, Matthew Dallek, is with us. Matt, it's great to see you.
It's great to see you too, Major, and I love that song. I remember it from my MTV days.
One thing leads to another. That's the theme of this book, how a group of people on the conservative, hard, extreme right in the 50s are still with us now. One thing has led to another.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that I'm interested in documenting in the book is how the ideas lead to another, right? How the ideas get seeded, and then other people pick them up, like people I call successors. And so the Birchers had their heyday in the 1960s, when in places like San Diego, but all over the country, they were notorious, pretty much a household name. And the ideas, though, once they fade by the early 70s, people pick up on the anti-establishment, more violent mode of politics, more explicit racism, anti-interventionism, right? Isolationism at a time when the Cold War was still alive. And then the conspiracy theories. And so one of the things is the ideas, right, and how they lead, and the kind of afterlife of those ideas.
So let's start with some very basics. We'll get to the society in a second, but who was John Birch as a person?
Yeah, John Birch, whose name would not otherwise probably be known today, was an evangelist turned Army intelligence officer. And he was in China in World War II with the U.S. Army, and he was murdered by Mao's communist forces about 10 days after World War II. And Robert Welch, the founder of the society, wrote a biography of Birch, alleging that his murder was covered up.
And that he was essentially the first victim of the Cold War.
Exactly.
The first American to die at the hands of our Cold War communist enemies. And it was no surprise to Robert Welch in this mythology retelling that he was a Christian evangelist.
And on top of that, though,
Killed by the godless communists.
Killed by the godless communists. But what made it really galling to him was that it was also covered up by our own government, according to him. And so in the kind of martyrdom story that he tells, the crime is not just that, the evil communists had murdered him in cold blood and that he was the first victim, as you say, but that the United States State Department, right, our own leaders, knew about this, and because they were sympathetic to the communists, they hid it from the public.
So said Robert Welch, the founder of the Birch Society.
Yes, and this idea that the communist threat within, at the highest levels of American government and life, that was the animating impulse behind, Robert Welch's movement and also a lot of other Birchers.
And just for the benefit of those who know or remember John Birch, separate from the Birch Society, he was, by all accounts, a solid member of the United States Army, brave, courageous, innovative.
Yeah, there's actually a book, a biography written about him by a scholar that came out in 2014. And his parents, though, in Georgia, at first embraced the use of his name.
Okay.
And they blessed it. But after a while, I think they were less happy with it. I don't get into that story in the book, but there's no evidence that John Birch would have been a wild about the idea of his name being appropriate. And again, his name probably would have been lost to history were
Otherwise.
it not for, this branding.
So when we say one thing leads to another, folks, let's just talk about a couple things that are very much in our conversation now. Vaccine skepticism. Well, the Birchers were against fluoride in the water. They're not exactly the same, but one thing leads to another.
Yeah, so the fluoridation is a great example. So the Birchers often argued that fluoridation was either part of a communist plot or that, as they said, it was a massive wedge for socialized medicine. And there was a deep skepticism of both public health dictates as they saw them, but also government, federal government or local government, telling you not just what to do, but what to put in your body. And fluoride touched on that. And that's, I think, a fairly common set of arguments or ideas that the vaccine deniers, right. have also wielded.
Are those who resisted mask mandates, or those who resisted or were skeptical of social distancing, all the things done on in the name of public health had, for those who resisted it, the same overhang to their mind of government control, government interference, dictates, and interference. And
as the Birchers said, and as contemporary MAGA people argue, that this was a way of trampling on and really eviscerating the Constitution. Their argument was you were depriving people of their individual liberties and forcing them, in a sense, in this authoritarian sort of way, and that was deeply un-American. And I think that those ideas, those arguments have been updated for a different set of COVID issues, but really resonate in the anti-fluoride campaign that the Birchers helped pioneer.
And when former President Trump tries to defend himself against indictments at the federal level, he brands the prosecutors Marxists and communists, enemies from within, who are destroying the country. So not altogether different than a Birchian approach to what government can or will do.
Absolutely. The Birchers, one of their key insights, I think, and I call it an insight for a reason, is that they understood how conspiracy theories and arguing that the enemy was inside the government, that could mobilize a subset of Americans to get active in the struggle for power. And it could be very effective politically. And the beauty of it for them was that even if members didn't necessarily think everyone was a card-carrying communist that they charged, that it was a kind of catch-all, right? It sort of said, it was a language that said, this person is against the Constitution, they're anti-American, they're not a patriot, and they are turning the country into something that it was never meant to be. And that shorthand, which Trump, I think, employs as well, speaks to his followers in a similar kind of way that I think it spoke to a lot of members of the Birch Society and people who sympathized with them.
And our internet culture makes that much more rapidly expressed and amplified, does it not?
Yeah, I mean, the internet, I think, has made it much harder, frankly, for Republican mandarins over the past couple decades, and especially the past decade, to control these kind of conspiracy theories. So someone like Mitch McConnell, for example, who doesn't seem to be a big fan of the big lie, right? That the 2020 election was stolen, and is certainly not a fan of Trump. It makes it harder for someone like that in a position of authority to contain these kinds of the kind of language, right, that Marxist, communist, but also these conspiracy theories that were better contained in the 1960s and 70s.
And we'll talk about the 60s and 70s when, if you traveled our country, you could see Birch billboards about issues, and you heard about them mentioned, and they were an issue for the Republican Party, to use Matt Dallek's word, contain. I'm Major Garrett. Matt Dallek is our guest. Birchers is the book. We'll be back for segment 2 in 1 second.
It's hard to kind of capture how big a deal they were. Bob Dylan did an entire song talking John Birch Paranoid Blues.
Welcome back to the Takeout. By the way, we're at Riss Restaurant having lunch. One of our favorite locations. They're always hospitable to us. We thank Riss for their hospitality. Matt Dallek is our special guest. Matt, tell my audience who your dad is.
How old he is?
No, who he is.
Oh, who he is? Yes. Well, my dad, who I
Because he's famous.
Yes, yes. I dedicate the book to my dad. He's a presidential historian.
Named?
Robert Dallek.
Very famous presidential
Written,
historian.
I believe, 15 books. Won a Bancroft Prize, and had a #1 New York Times bestseller for An Unfinished Life, for his John F. Kennedy biography, in which he, among other things, revealed the John F. Kennedy's serious health problems for the first time.
How did growing up in that family and with that famous father influence your life?
Well, that's a great question. Look, on one level, it was an inspiration, right? Because I saw my dad in the study behind our house in Los Angeles, and he'd have these piles of documents that he had gotten from the archives or copied from the archives. And he was working away for years, right, on these books. And so I got a kind of intuitive feel for not just archival research, but how exciting it can be, right? Because you're finding stuff that maybe people have not seen in decades. And
Or ever.
or if they've seen it.
Or only a select few
Yep.
people saw them and didn't want the public to see them.
Exactly.
I was
They don't-
hoping they would never
That's
find
right.
them.
That's right. And that might also be lost for who knows how long if you don't actually find a way to incorporate it. So that was really cool and exciting. He was also a great professor when he taught at UCLA for 3 decades. He would have 400 students in a lecture class. He would give them standing ovations on the last day of the class. I mean, he really was so very inspiring. At first, though, I went to grad school. I got a PhD, but I decided I did not want to go into academia right away. And I actually went and worked in politics for a few years. I worked as a speechwriter. And I slowly kind of made my way back, though, to try to find my own path. Realized I liked teaching, I liked writing and researching, and kind of made my peace with the fact that I'll never write as many books as the 15 he's written.
Very good, very good. So when we went to break, we talked about the Birchers in the 60s, which was, in one way, their heyday, but now I would say they have an indirect heyday that's even bigger than the 60s. But talk about the Birchers in the 60s.
Well, the Birchers in the 60s, it's really...
Which is what the shorthand was, ladies and gentlemen, the Birchers.
Yeah, the Birchers, and...
Or just Birchers.
Yeah, and it's hard to recall. It's hard to kind of capture how big a deal they were, because for example, Bob Dylan did an entire song talking John Birch Paranoid Blues. The Chad Mitchell Trio did a song about the Birchers. They became really embedded in the culture, and they were known to critics as deeply conspiratorial and a threat to democracy, because they had really smeared people like Dwight Eisenhower, who Robert Welch once labeled a dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy.
Right, so the leader of this group said the President of the United States, Supreme Allied Commander in World War II, who oversaw D-Day and everything that flowed from it, was a committed communist agent.
Well, and also, of course, the leader of the Republican Party. So,
out there, ladies.
Yes,
I mean, way
yes.
out there.
Yeah, and when that news broke, and also because the Birchers were secretive, they had 20-person chapters.
We'll get into why about that in a second.
Yes, and they didn't like to disclose who their members were. And so, remember, in the 15 years after the defeat of Nazi Germany, there were many fears in the United States of kind of homegrown fascist movements. And so critics were alarmed by the Birchers. They called them really the most violent and aggressive and an ugly far-right threat since, say, the brown shirt threat or America First of the 1930s. At the same time, though, they were mocked, right? A lot of people, they were called little old ladies in tennis shoes, pathetic, right? Kind of like, these are crazy people. They're part of this paranoid, minority, and they're going to go the way of the horse and buggy. And so there was this interesting debate. And then you had conservatives like William Buckley or Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, who struggle, or Nixon, and they struggle with how to handle them.
Because they knew at the grassroots they were active, they voted, they talked, they organized. They were not pivotal, but they were not someone you could ignore or antagonize without
Yeah.
risk.
So yeah, and just a very brief story. Some listeners may know it. So Richard Nixon, 1962, the former vice president, went back to California, ran for governor. I mean, he's a giant, right? A political giant. And the Birchers hated Nixon. And Nixon hated the Birchers, and he denounced them very aggressively. And in that primary, Nixon was challenged by a guy from his right named Joe Schell. I think a former quarterback at USC, a leader in California legislature, and he took about a third of the vote because he had a lot of the Birch energy and Birch support. And that damaged Nixon in the general election, which he lost to Pat Brown, the Democrat. And that was kind of an object lesson in what can happen if you go too far to denounce your so-called far-right base.
And of course, the historical irony there, ladies and gentlemen, is in the House of Representatives, Richard Nixon made his name as a virulent anti-communist who exposed Alger Hiss, or helped to expose Alger Hiss, but he wasn't anti-communist enough for the Birchers.
Yeah. So one of the things I argue in the book is that there is a significant division, an ideological division between the Bircher fringe and these more mainstream conservatives. Even Goldwater, but also Nixon and Reagan, who often rejected, especially in government, a lot of the Birch ideas. They rejected the conspiracy theories oftentimes, and were much more pragmatic as well. And so that tension, I mean, you can see it in 62, you can see it in throughout the book, I think, as well, but it's a real fissure. And yet, the dilemma, of course, is that people like Goldwater, even Reagan, they need to be careful not to go too far to alienate potential supporters.
How much of the origins of the Birch Society were racist or anti-Semitic?
Well, look, the Birchers maintained that they refused to have KKK members. They were not racist. They had some Jewish members, some African-American members. What I document in the book, though, is that there were many bigots who were both at the top of the organization and also bubbling up from below. And I show that in the memos they write, in the speeches that they give.
Language they use.
The language they use. And the other thing is that, the Birch argument, the Society's official argument, which I think many members believed, was that the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s was a plot directed from the Kremlin. And that was similar to what
That if it weren't for Moscow's meddling, there would be no organic movement to achieve civil rights in this country.
Exactly. So rather than say that this was an organic movement for racial equality and social justice, they said this was all part that African Americans were being, and white Americans supportive of it, were being manipulated by the Kremlin to basically destroy the Constitution via the civil rights movement.
Dupes of the communist government.
Yeah, and that was of a piece, really, with what white supremacists were also arguing. And actually, I think it does have echoes in the birtherism, claim that Barack Obama was not born in this country. He was basically a foreign element planted here as a fraud to also destroy the country from within, as the conspiracy theorists had it.
And as we set this up for our next segment, talk to me about birtherism and Trump and this lineage that goes back to the Birchers.
Well, Trump was, of course, the most, as many people will remember, Trump was probably became the most prominent birtherite of Obama's presidency. I mean, he really led the charge, and he was in touch with leaders, I think, of the Tea Party. Sarah Palin, at one point, who I quote in the book, says very nice things about Trump's leadership of the birther movement. And Trump had a very prominent, I think, in fact, that's in part how he built up a Twitter following, right? It wasn't, the art of the deal that built it up. It was this birther claim.
Galvanizing people around this question of the otherism of Obama.
And that Obama was illegitimate, right? He was ineligible to be president because of this conspiracy. And he went on also mainstream outlets like The View and propagated this idea too.
The idea being the enemy within. Bircherite in the 50s and 60s, a part of our contemporary politics now. One thing, ladies and gentlemen, leads to another. Matt Dallek is our guest. Segment 3 of The Takeout in just 1 second.
Bill Schlafly was a member for a time, and it certainly was opposed to the feminist movement.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Matthew Dallek is our guest. The book, Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. So, we've mentioned his name, Robert Welch. Give my audience a little bit of sense of who he was.
Well, he was a candy manufacturer, and his company sold, I think, pom-poms and junior mints and all kinds of other well-known candies.
Sugar
at the
babies.
time. Sugar babies, right? And he was also a member in the leadership of the National Association of Manufacturers.
A business guy.
A business guy, and also
White,
an author.
well-to-do business guy.
White, wealthy, Christian, and also an author. He wrote a number of books in the 1950s. And in the 50s, gave a lot of lectures and wrote a lot of books basically saying, this communist conspiracy is taking over the world, including internally within the United States.
And yet he had a kind of respect for communist organizations, communist cadres, and you mentioned this number earlier, and I want you to go into a little bit of detail about it. John Birch Society groups were limited strictly to a membership of 20, and once it got to 20, it had to break off into another group, like communist cells, correct?
Yeah, and I believe that the Birch leadership was open about, they said, we copied this tactic from our enemy because they've had such great success, so why wouldn't we want to ape their tactics?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea, too, was that they wanted to keep the society, I think, hidden from public view and the members hidden because they were worried that if the communists, this is their view, if the communists discovered that this incredibly effective movement was afoot, that they would then destroy it before the Birch Society could really be built up.
Mm-hmm.
And so they wanted to keep it.
So their paranoia
subtraded.
was 360.
I mean,
It sounds like it went in almost
yeah.
every direction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, they viewed it as
the communists are stalking us. We have enemies
Yeah.
in our government. Our president's a communist agent. Everywhere
Well,
there are things to be afraid of.
The logic was that, according to Welch and others, 60 to 70% of American institutions were basically communist run. And that, the estimates varied, but 5 years, the country would be completely communist.
Lost.
So the country was always at 2 minutes to midnight, or maybe 2 seconds to midnight. And with that kind of
of bleak.
It was extremely bleak. And with that worldview, though, it becomes a little more understandable how you see your enemies in the media, the higher education,
Among the elites.
the elites everywhere, and so the sense that they had to kind of, and at one point, for example, I think a woman member of the society wrote in and suggested, look, send us our Birch Society material in basically brown paper envelopes because we don't want basically neighbors knowing we're members, but also the Postal Service is the most likely first wedge of this attack on us, and we don't want the Postal Service knowing we're members of this group.
Right. Send it like you would pornography.
I mean, or worse, right? Yes, exactly. Yeah. So there was,
Just to illustrate the point.
Just one last thing, though, about this 20-person chapter. The other thing, which is actually very insightful, is that they could then operate inside their communities. And they could kind of take the recommendations from the leadership in headquarters in Belmont, Massachusetts, and make it their own. So if they wanted to try and take over a PTA or run for school board or maybe hold a picket at a local movie house because it wasn't showing Americanist John Wayne films, they could kind of make the society their own. They could act, right? They could act on these ideas.
Right.
And Birchers felt empowered. And that was one of the insights, I think, because they didn't want to just talk about it. They wanted to actually do something about the movement.
Was it anti-feminist?
Well, Phil Schlafly was a member for a time, and it certainly was opposed to the feminist movement and had a vision of a kind of early 20th century role for women, right, as homemakers, right, and not in the workforce. And yet, as I argue in the book, Birch women, who were very effective, capitalized on the second wave of feminism and the increased movement of women into the workforce and into politics as well, because they got very active politically. And so one of the interesting paradoxes for women Birchers is both their ideological views, but also their incredible level of political activism and engagement.
You mentioned Birchers could discuss and wage campaigns to talk to their PTA, run for school board. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a conversation in our country. It was in Virginia, it's in Tennessee, it's in Mississippi, it's in Florida. It's all over the country about not necessarily PTAs, but school boards, curriculum, books that should or should not be included in curriculum, et cetera, all echoes of Birchian movements and ideology in the 60s.
Absolutely. And the Birch Society, too, was initially set up and remained primarily, as they saw it, an educational group. And what they wanted to do was...
They all do.
Yes, that's right. They're all the nonprofit.
All education.
All quote-unquote education. But what they in part had given up, I think, or looked askance at the two-party political system as too corrupt, right? Eisenhower's party, is communist run. And what they wanted to do was educate the masses, kind of tutor ordinary Americans about the dire nature of the threat. Well, how do you do that? One of the ways you do it is by going into the schools and saying the textbooks that our students are learning are actually communist-inspired. Sex education is immoral and part of this kind of communist effort to weaken the moral fiber of this country. And so the schools became important battlegrounds for Birchers, as did media and this alternative views that they had, right? The books and the articles that they produced, right? The alternative worldview to get around the kind of CBSs of the world. Mm-hmm. And they were very effective, I think, and savvy in attacking the schools. And also these are civic institutions that were not seen as particularly political at the time.
Do the political warriors on the right of our era know much about the Birch Society? Do they talk about it? Do they consider themselves successors or part of that lineage?
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic question. And it's very hard to tease out how aware they are. So someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who represents a part of the district of Larry McDonald, who was a leader of the Birch Society for a time, I don't know if she's, aware of his association. But I have taken note of how leaders of MAGA, for example, have talked about the Birch Society, or familiar names, people like Alex Jones, who is basically, I think at one point he said, my dad was a Bircher, and the book that sort of turned him on to conspiracy theories was a classic, or the text of the Birch Society, helped radicalize Alex Jones. Milk Mulvaney, who you've had on this program, at one point spoke to, because the Birch Society still exists, and he spoke a number of years ago to a Birch group. So I think a lot of them are aware of it. I don't think that they've necessarily studied it and kind of copied it, but I think that there is a kind of way in which
Steve Bannon is very much aware of your book, has said complimentary things about it. Is he? Yeah. He sounds like he's aware of what the Birch Society is.
I mean, according to his podcast, he held up the book twice and said he thought it was an incredible book.
How does that make you feel?
Well, I at first I was very nervous because someone told me he had, held up your book, and I didn't know what he said about it or me, and then he said it was incredible, and a couple of good friends of mine actually said, look, that's actually a compliment because it means that what you were doing is actually history rather than primarily ideology, and I don't know why he likes the book, but my guess is that one reason I give credit to the Birchers for their political insights. I show how powerful they were. And I think he probably likes the anti-establishment theme, right? That the Birchers, the fringe, was kind of opposed to the Mitch McConnells of the world, wanted to kind of take over the Republican Party. And as another person said, that maybe it's a kind of blueprint for him.
Well, maybe not. We will see. Time will tell on that. Birchers is the name of the book, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. We're at risk. Lunch has arrived. I've already plowed in, but Matthew Dallek, our special author guest, will do that in the intervening break. And when we come back, segment 4 coming your way in just one moment.
The Birchers were very effective conspiracy entrepreneurs. They're really entrepreneurial in how they kind of describe these conspiracies and how they sold them.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Riss is our host restaurant. Lunch is very good, as always. Matt is enjoying his. I'm enjoying mine. The book, Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. What did the Birchers' influence have to do with QAnon?
Well, again, I'm interested in the ideas, and QAnon, as much as I understand it, is a conspiracy theory about really an evil government plot to destroy American liberties and also take down Trump. And again, the details differ, but the music is the same, or very similar at least.
Right.
And
Plot from within, destroy the country. We have to galvanize ourselves and organize ourselves to stop it.
and that progressives or liberals, right, who that they are really the greatest enemy. I mean, they don't call them liberals; they call them Marxists, or and also that career civil servants, right, people in the FBI or elsewhere in the Department of Justice, people who really are essential to kind of the functioning,
Or anyone part of the regulatory state.
But they're essential to the healthy functioning of democracy and the functioning of government, that they are part of this plot. And that, of course, has all kind of, because if you believe that, once you believe that, there are a lot of other things you can believe about, maybe what's happening at a pizza restaurant. And then a guy came in and because he thought that there was like a child sex ring
In the basement that did not exist.
and then he shot it up, and he's still in jail. So QAnon and I think that there's a reason why at least these studies of the January 6th participants, their QAnon adherents were represented in a considerable way.
What did the John Birch Society and its members think about Roe versus Wade and the question of abortion, if anything?
So the Birchers were early on, I think, to the issue of abortion. And even before, I believe, Roe v. Wade, there were Birch documents or members of the society who describe abortion as evil, like part of this evil wave of moral transgression that was fundamentally an affront to the character, the Christian character and values of the country as they saw it. And at a summer camp, because the Birchers held summer camps.
Summer camps.
There was a state legislature, I think from Ohio, and according to the article I read, she passed around a vial with like a dead fetus to dramatize the horror of abortion for the campers. I mean, these are I think high school students, and of course it was of a piece with many other issues like rock and roll and other issues that
drugs,
just seen as part of this,
counterculture.
Really a kind of as part of this communist plot to really destroy the minds and the moral value system of American youth in particular. So the Birchers were very early to that, and then the last thing I'll say is in terms of Roe v. Wade, one of their biggest campaigns, they had front groups, and one of their biggest campaigns was impeach Earl Warren.
Who was?
Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Republican, former governor of California, and made a number of very famous decisions, including Brown v. Board of Education, but also banning prayer in schools and giving rights to criminal defendants. And there was a series of decisions that the Birchers thought were not just unconstitutional, but, again, fundamentally at odds with the character of the country. They were, communist adjacent, if not outright traitorous.
And appointed by Dwight Eisenhower.
Exactly.
The
Yeah.
agent of the communist government.
So they
believed.
Yes. And
so it all fit.
It did all fit.
Which is one of the things that keeps the conspiracy theory going. It fits at a notional level if you believe the pieces ought to fit. If you're inclined to believe that you need to put pieces together, they do fuse together psychologically.
Look, in most conspiracies have some kind of element of truth to them. But often it's not a very large element. And oftentimes you can spin out of that a at least semi-plausible sounding plot. And
You
so,
see it
yeah.
not because it's there, but because you see it.
Yeah, well, it's really about belief, right? It's almost about believing. And because you believe it, right, evidence...
Therefore, it's true.
And evidence can't really counteract it.
Right.
And then, so...
A pre-Enlightenment orientation, ladies and gentlemen.
And-
I believe it, therefore it's true. Not that it's true, therefore I believe it.
Yeah, I mean, it really is divorced from facts, in a sense. And, another point I make is that the Birchers were very effective conspiracy entrepreneurs. They're really entrepreneurial in how they kind of describe these conspiracies and how they sold them. And getting back to Roe v. Wade, though, the Supreme Court, was seen as one of the, I guess, beachheads, if you will, of this communist conspiracy. And so Roe v. Wade was, in a way, of a piece with a series of decisions over at least 2 decades, maybe more, in the Birch worldview that had trampled on the Constitution.
And if you drove around in your car in the 60s in rural parts of America or just outside of large cities like my hometown of San Diego, I remember these billboards as a child. Something about either impeach Earl Warren or overturn the Warren court or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And those were all Bircher financed.
Yep, help save America, impeach Earl Warren.
Okay.
And that was one of their, I think, most effective and most iconic campaigns. People knew about it, right? And it was visible. And so, we have, of course, the internet today. But this was something that became iconic because people saw it and they couldn't avoid it. And they were traveling on the road.
And wasn't it said in your book that in defense of this or the rationale behind it, they said, we may not win, but our enemies will know we were here.
Exactly. And Welch, the founder of the Birch Society, said he understood it was unlikely they were going to impeach Earl Warren. Because at the time, especially, it was a very radical step. You didn't really impeach chief justices. And he understood that Congress, which had the constitutional right, but Congress was highly unlikely to impeach him. But he said, we are going to fight like hell, essentially. And by the time we're finished, the enemy will know, that we have basically taken a pound of flesh out of them. And to some extent, I think he was right, because it generated a lot of movement and questions. I mean, they injected the issue into the public sphere in a way that maybe arguably it had not been before. And the question of the court, right, became more political in that sense. And now Birchers weren't the only ones doing it, but they did help contribute to that dynamic.
We'll conclude where we started, quoting again from The Fix. You told me something wrong. I know I listened too long, but one thing leads to another. Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. Matthew Dallek is the author. He's been our special guest. Our thanks again to Riss. Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial.
The book goes up to January 6th. The last third is about the afterlife of the Birch Society, how its ideas shape the right.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. I'm Major Garrett. You already knew that. Matt Dallek is our guest this week. His book, Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. When did this idea come to you, and how difficult was it to pursue?
Great question. Like a lot of other historians and journalists, right, searching for explanations of Trump. It came to me, I think, early on in the Trump presidency, 2017, 2018. But it evolved because at first I was thinking I would just look at the leaders of the Birch Society. That's not what the book became. All credit to actually my publisher, Basic Books, for pushing me to expand it and try to write a history of this movement, and also to bring it up to the present. And the book goes up to January 6th. The last third is about the afterlife of the Birch Society, how its ideas shape the right, and really essentially the Birchite takeover of the Republican Party and conservatism over the decades. In terms of appeal, well, I think the way I initially conceived of it was not the right way. I think the way it turned out was sort of the right way, right, to tell this movement. And the book, I think, it was hard to sell, although I got a couple of good interest from good publishers. And then I would say what's been interesting, too, is that since it's come out, and I did not anticipate this at all, I've had a lot of people email me to tell me their stories about their experiences with the Birch Society.
Their family stories.
Family stories, and also maybe their personal memories.
Okay.
And that has been really interesting, and actually information I wish I'd known when I was writing the book. Maybe it'll, if there's an updated, afterward, be included. But it's interesting to kind of hear people and how these memories live on and how it affected them and how they remember it decades later.
Reading the book, it strikes me that one of the things that political reporters tend to forget and overlook is that this is still a center-right country, white and Christian in its primary identification. Fact. Birchers are part of that story, and a not insignificant part of the story when you think about the duration and the idea that you implied a moment ago that Bircher philosophy was storming the steps of the Capitol on January 6, 2021.
Yeah, and one of the points I try to make, so at one point in the book, I think there's a senator who says in 1964 that the Birch Society is this weird foreign presence in America. One of the points I try to make in the book is that is totally wrong, that they're actually deeply American, and that they're part of a much deeper, longer tradition of a kind of what I describe as a far-right alternative political tradition. And for the reasons, we've talked about, right? The conspiracy theories, the more explicit racism.
Hostility to government, change.
Yeah, and the sense of the enemy within, and also that, government is not just a problem, but that it's evil, right? Which is a distinction from how Reagan thought about government and talked about it, at least as president. And also this more violent mode of politics, because the Birchers
much more confrontational.
Yeah, the Birchers, and people are writing me stories about their confrontations with Birchers. Birchers chasing them out of a hotel, for example, or blaring when their children are doing a UNICEF drive, blaring a speech by Robert Welch talking about the communist evils of UNICEF to these kids. So very confrontational and really anti-democratic in a way, at least anti-multiracial democracy, I think, as we have come to understand it. And so one of the points I make is that they're deeply American and they're a part of the country's history, but they were more extreme, consigned to the fringe, and they've become more mainstream. But still, I think, as you suggested in your question, not the dominant, not a majoritarian movement.
So, we have 3 threshold questions almost everyone on the show gets. I think you're probably familiar with them, so take them whichever order you prefer. Most influential book in your life and why? Favorite movie? And if you're going to enjoy some music, what artist or genre is that most likely to be?
Okay, favorite movie, absolutely Star Wars, which maybe is
4.
a familiar
We'll
answer.
start at 4, right? New Hope.
This is the first one that was made. Exactly. Right. Yes, and because it
now numbered 4. Yes.
Yeah, because it came out when I was a kid, and so I saw it maybe 8, 9 times in the movie theater. Absolutely iconic. Favorite music. Favorite band.
Doesn't have to be a band. It could be an artist.
Yeah.
Or genre.
I really like. I like Bruce Springsteen. I'm sure you get it a lot.
We do get it a lot.
Yeah, but
you too and Bruce Springsteen,
yeah.
the most frequently
Yes.
cited in that answer.
Well, the thing about Bruce Springsteen is that he's really a brilliant guy, and he's kind of a poet
and one hell of an entertainer.
He's an incredible musician, but when you listen to him talk about his music, right? It's sort of, I think, beyond the music itself. So again, it's sort of an obvious one. And then
most influential book and why?
Oh, most influential book. That's really tough. I would say that I'm going to go with a really important book for me was one that I read, I think, right after college called A Bright Shining Lie.
Neil Sheehan,
who I think incredible journalist, and this was a biography of John Paul Vann, but it really was an incredible, like a tour de force, like a window into all the flaws of the Vietnam War, all the failures on the U.S. part.
It is an epic book mentioned on this program a couple of times before. Matt Dallek has been our special guest. Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. I'm Major Garrett. It's been your Takeout Outtake Especial. We shall see you next week.